The air in the room tastes like burnt ambition and stale coffee. My hands are shaking, not with fear anymore, but with a cold, humming energy that feels alien in my veins. He stands across the polished table, the fluorescent lights of the conference room reflecting in his eyes I once thought held the future. Now they just hold a dawning horror, a complete and utter blankness. His mouth is slightly open like a fish out of water, gasping for air that isn't there. The silence stretches, thick and suffocating, broken only by the frantic thumping in my own chest. This is it. The moment everything shifts. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me more than you know. Before this room, before the silence and the shock on his face, there was noise. There was the hum of servers, the excited chatter of a small team crammed into a space too small for their dreams, the constant ping of notifications, the late-night laughter fueled by too much pizza and not enough sleep. That was my life, my startup. It wasn't just a business. It was a living thing I had poured myself into, piece by excruciating piece. We met at a tech conference, cliché, I know, but it felt like fate at the time. He was already established, a senior executive at one of the big players in the industry. I was just starting out, armed with little more than a prototype and a burning belief in my idea. He seemed impressed, maybe even a little intrigued. He talked about synergy, about the future of the market, about how my vision fit into the bigger picture. Looking back, I see the threads he was weaving, the way he was pulling me into his orbit, making me believe he was a partner, an ally. We built a life together. A beautiful apartment overlooking the city, weekend trips, dinners where we talked for hours about everything and nothing. We were a power couple, people said. His established success, my rising star. It felt right. It felt like we were building something together, even if our professional worlds were technically separate. He'd listen to my ideas, offer advice, always carefully phrased, always seeming helpful. He'd talk about the challenges I faced, the sharks in the water, the difficulty of breaking through. He painted a picture of a brutal landscape and positioned himself as the guide, the protector. My startup, Lumina, was in data analytics, focusing on a niche application in market trend prediction. It was disruptive, innovative. We had early traction, promising pilot programs. The long nights were paying off. I saw a path to profitability, a way to genuinely make a difference, to shake up an industry that had grown a little stagnant. It wasn't about getting rich quick, it was about building something meaningful, something that was truly mine. He was always there, a shadow presence in my professional life. He'd ask questions, dig into details about our technology, our client acquisition strategy, our funding rounds. He framed it as concern, as wanting to help me navigate the treacherous waters he knew so well. I shared everything. Why wouldn't I? He was my husband, my partner in life. I trusted him implicitly. I showed him our core algorithms, explained our unique data processing methods, discussed our confidential investor deck. I laid bare the very heart of Lumina. The first hint of a tremor wasn't a jolt, but a slow, insidious shift. Deals that seemed certain suddenly stalled. Investors who had been enthusiastic became cagey. Key potential hires backed out at the last minute, offering vague excuses. It felt like walking through a fog, hitting invisible walls. I blamed myself, blamed market fluctuations, blamed bad luck. I worked harder, longer. The bright-eyed optimism of the early days began to fray. Then came the day the ground gave way. It wasn't a single moment, but a series of events that crashed over me like a tidal wave. First, the news broke about a major player in the industry launching a new service. Their announcement detailed features that were eerily similar to our proprietary technology, applications we had only shared with a handful of trusted individuals, one of whom was him. The timing was too perfect, too devastating to be a coincidence. Before I could even process that blow, the call started. Investors pulling out, citing market saturation and increased competition. Our largest pilot client sent a curt email terminating the agreement, effective immediately, explaining they were going with a more established solution. The whispers started circulating. that Lumina was built on shaky ground, that our technology wasn't truly novel, that we were already behind. The carefully constructed world I had built began to crumble around me. I confronted him that night. The air in our apartment, usually warm and familiar, was suddenly thick with tension. I showed him the news articles, the client emails, the withdrawal notices from investors. My voice was shaking, trying to hold onto the last vestiges of control. I asked him, pleaded with him, to tell me what he knew, how this could be happening. He didn't deny it immediately. He didn't have to. His silence was an admission. Then his face hardened, losing the gentle mask he usually wore. The eyes I had trusted became cold, calculating. He didn't raise his voice, which was worse. It was a quiet, chilling certainty. He told me he had shared information. Not out of malice, he claimed, but because he saw the writing on the wall. He said my startup was a small boat in a storm, destined to sink. He said he was protecting his own interests, his career, his company. He said he had merely accelerated the inevitable. Then came the words that echoed in the sudden, vast emptiness of the room, words that felt like stones dropped into a deep well. You're too small, too naive. This is a brutal industry. You'll never recover from this. You should just cut your losses. Never recover. The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. He didn't just predict my failure. He decreed it. He had not only betrayed me professionally, but he had ripped apart the personal trust that formed the foundation of our life. In that moment, the man I had married ceased to exist. In his place was a stranger, someone I hadn't known at all, someone who saw me not as a partner, but as a stepping stone, an inconvenience to be removed. The days that followed were a blur of firefighting and despair. My team was demoralized. Funds were drying up fast. Payroll was looming. Every door I knocked on remained firmly shut. His words, "You'll never recover," played on repeat in my mind, a cruel lullaby. I felt exposed, raw, bleeding out in the open. The betrayal cut deeper than any financial loss. It was a wound to my very identity. The ambition that had fueled me curdled into a bitter, metallic taste. I felt like a fool, utterly and completely devastated. I tried everything. Pivot the technology? Too late. Find a new market? No resources. Seek bridging finance? No one would touch us. The whispers he had started, the damage he had inflicted by strategically leaking information, had effectively poisoned the well. He hadn't just sunk my boat, he poisoned the entire harbor. There were nights I just sat in the dark apartment, the city lights a mocking backdrop, and felt the weight of absolute failure crushing me. Tears came easily at first, hot and angry, then dried up, leaving behind a brittle emptiness. The apartment felt sterile, his presence a ghost in every room. We barely spoke. He moved through the space, as if I were invisible, occasionally offering hollow, condescending advice about how I should wind things down gracefully. Graceful surrender was the furthest thing from my mind. Something shifted during those dark nights. The despair didn't vanish, but it began to coexist with something else. A cold, hard kernel of defiance. His certainty that I would never recover wasn't just a prediction, it was a sentence. And I refused to accept his judgment. The pain of the betrayal, the public humiliation, the potential loss of everything I had built, it all coalesced into a quiet, simmering rage. I started digging, not just into potential funding options or new business strategies. I started digging into him, his company, his position. I knew the industry, knew the players. I started looking for vulnerabilities, weaknesses, things he thought were secure. My grief transformed into focus, sharp and unwavering. I stopped feeling sorry for myself and started gathering information, piece by agonizing piece. His company, Vertex Solutions, was a behemoth, entrenched and powerful. But even giants have weak points. Their strength was also their rigidity. They were slow to adapt, relied on old infrastructure, and their biggest competitor, a smaller, more agile firm called Aegis Tech, had been steadily chipping away at their market share for years. Aegis was innovative, nimble, but lacked the deep pockets and market penetration Vertex had. An unlikely target for me, it seemed, at first. The idea came to me not in a flash of inspiration, but slowly, meticulously, like assembling a complex puzzle. It wasn't enough to survive. Survival left him unharmed, his prediction validated in his eyes. Recovery wasn't enough. Recovery still meant living with the scar of his betrayal. I needed to do more. I needed to turn his weapon against him. I needed to not just recover, but to thrive in a way that made his actions utterly self-destructive. My focus shifted from saving Lumina as it was to strategically leveraging what little remained. Lumina's core asset wasn't just the technology, much of which he had compromised. It was the team, their expertise, their understanding of the market niche, and the desperate energy born from facing ruin. And critically, I still held the foundational IP, the deep understanding of the underlying principles, even if specific applications had been copied. I started making calls again, but not for funding for Lumina. I called contacts I hadn't spoken to in years, people who knew me from my earlier career, before the startup, people who respected my mind and my drive. I was discreet, speaking in hypotheticals at first, testing the waters. I presented a new kind of opportunity, not just an investment, but a strategic acquisition, a chance to gain a competitive edge. The target, Aegis Tech. It seemed insane. Lumina was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, and I was proposing acquiring a company that was, while smaller than Vertex, still significantly larger and more established than mine had ever been. But Aegis had its own struggles. They needed capital to scale, to truly challenge Vertex. They had the market presence, the sales channels, the operational structure. I had the disruptive technology, the uncompromised core IP, the agile team, and a unique, deeply personal understanding of Vertex's weaknesses, thanks to my husband's unwitting tutorials. The plan was audacious, risky, and required absolute secrecy. Every conversation was held in secure locations. Every document was encrypted. I didn't tell my team the full scope at first, only that we were exploring strategic partnerships to ensure our survival and growth. They were running on fumes, but their loyalty, forged in the fires of the past few months, was immense. I reached out to the CEO of Aegis, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Clara. I didn't pull any punches. I laid out Lumina's precarious situation, the story of the betrayal, without naming him initially, and the strategic rationale behind the acquisition. I showed her the core IP that hadn't been compromised, the next-generation tech Lumina was developing, which was light years ahead of what Vertex had copied. I showed her how combining Lumina's innovation engine with Aegis's market reach wasn't just a merger, it was building a weapon specifically designed to disrupt Vertex. Clara was skeptical but intrigued. She knew Vertex. She knew their tactics. And she knew that Aegis, alone, would always be fighting an uphill battle against their resources. My proposal offered a way to leapfrog Vertex, to leverage their own dirty tricks against them. It was a high-stakes gamble, requiring significant capital and a willingness to move fast and decisively. Raising the money was the hardest part. No traditional VC would touch us. The market perception was still too damaged by the fallout from his actions. I had to look elsewhere. Angel investors who believed in me personally, private equity firms specializing in distressed assets and aggressive market plays, even a few unlikely allies who had their own grudges against Vertex. It was a patchwork quilt of funding, each thread secured with relentless pitching, brutal honesty about the risks, and a compelling vision of the potential rewards. I leveraged every contact, called in every favor, pushed myself to the absolute limit. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. The apartment became just a place to store clothes and occasionally collapse. The silence between us stretched into an abyss. He seemed oblivious, caught up in his own success, his company's new product launch a major triumph, built on the ruins of my dreams. He occasionally commented on my long hours, mistaking my grim determination for desperate flailing. The due diligence process was grueling. Combining two companies, one struggling, one stable but needing a catalyst, was immensely complex. Legal teams, financial analysts, technology audits. It was a constant barrage of questions, hurdles, and potential deal breakers. There were moments, deep in the process, when I felt the old despair creeping back in, the fear that it was too much, that he had been right, that I couldn't recover. But then I would remember his face, cold and dismissive, and his words, "You'll never recover from this." That memory was the fuel. It burned away the fear, leaving behind only a fierce, cold resolve. I wouldn't just recover. I would redefine what recovery meant. We structured the deal as an acquisition of Lumina by Aegis, but with a twist. I would become the CEO of the combined entity. It was a complex arrangement, designed to preserve Lumina's core innovation team and IP while leveraging Aegis's infrastructure. We moved with lightning speed, keeping the negotiations completely confidential, signing NDAs that threatened ruin for any leak. The final pieces fell into place over a frantic few weeks. Lawyers worked around the clock. Money changed hands in secure transfers. The acquisition was ready to be announced. And I knew exactly how I wanted him to find out. He was scheduled to give the keynote address at the annual industry conference. It was his moment of triumph, celebrating Vertex's latest success, the success built on stealing my work. I had arranged for the official press release announcing the Aegis acquisition of Lumina and my appointment as CEO to hit the wires exactly 10 minutes before his keynote was scheduled to begin. I wasn't at the conference. I didn't want a public spectacle. I wanted a private, precise delivery of the consequence. I was in the conference room of the newly combined Aegis Lumina headquarters, watching his keynote stream on a large screen, surrounded by Clara and the core team who had fought through the trenches with me. He stepped onto the stage, confident, beaming. The crowd applauded. He began to speak, his voice smooth, authoritative, talking about innovation, about market leadership, about the future. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. Then, the first phone started ringing in the audience. Then another. And another. People checking their emails, their news feeds. A ripple went through the crowd. Faces began to change, curiosity, then surprise, then shock. Whispers spread like wildfire. On the screen, I saw him falter slightly, his smile tightening. He glanced off stage, his eyes narrowing, trying to understand the sudden shift in the room's energy. One of his aides rushed onto the stage, a tablet in his hand, whispering urgently in his ear. I watched his face as he read the headline, the press release. The color drained from his face. His eyes went wide, then narrowed into slits of disbelief and dawning horror. He stopped speaking mid-sentence. The confident executive, the man who had told me I would never recover, froze. He stood there on the stage, in front of hundreds of his peers, his colleagues, his competitors, utterly blindsided. He hadn't just lost a potential rival in Lumina, he had unwittingly enabled his largest competitor, Aegis, to acquire the very technology he had tried to bury, led by the woman he thought he had destroyed. He had handed Aegis the key weapon they needed to challenge Vertex's dominance, forged from the ashes of my supposedly failed startup. The silence in the auditorium, even through the screen, was deafening. The applause died down. All eyes were on him, this suddenly broken figure on the stage. He had predicted my ruin, orchestrated my downfall, and in doing so, he had created the very force that would now challenge him directly, powerfully, on his own turf. He had pointed the gun at my head, fired, and somehow, the bullet had ricocheted back, hitting him square in the chest. He never finished that keynote. He stumbled off stage, followed by a swarm of concerned colleagues and a buzz of shocked speculation from the audience. On the screen, the news reports were already popping up. Aegis Tech acquires Lumina, shakes up analytics market. New CEO to lead combined entity, my name, beside the title. In the conference room, my team erupted in a quiet, exhausted cheer. Clara squeezed my arm, her eyes bright with victory. But for me, it wasn't elation. It was quieter, colder. A deep, abiding sense of vindication, yes. A satisfaction that went to the bone. But also, a profound sadness for what had been lost. Not just the business, not just the naive trust, but the person I thought I had married, the future I thought we were building together. The aftermath wasn't a clean cut. It was messy, complicated. His company's stock took a hit. Internally, there were investigations, repercussions. He faced questions, accusations of negligence, of underestimating the competition, of mishandling sensitive information. His position became untenable. He didn't lose everything immediately, but the damage to his reputation, his career trajectory, was significant, perhaps irreparable. He had built his success on ruthlessness, on seeing people as disposable. Now, that ruthlessness had been turned against him, and he had been the one found wanting. Our personal life, unsurprisingly, evaporated. There was no shouting match, no dramatic confrontation. There was just a quiet, final dissolution. He moved out. The apartment, once filled with our shared life, became just a space. The divorce was swift and cold, handled through lawyers. There was nothing left to fight over, not really. The real battle had been fought and won in the marketplace, in the strategic maneuvering, in the quiet, relentless pursuit of turning betrayal into victory. Leading the combined Aegis Lumina was a new challenge. It required different skills, different energy. It wasn't a scrappy startup fight anymore. It was about integrating two cultures, scaling operations, competing head-to-head with giants, including the one he worked for. The scar of the betrayal remained, a reminder of the cost of trusting too easily. But it also served as a constant source of strength, a testament to resilience, to the fact that being underestimated can be your greatest advantage. He was right about one thing. I didn't recover. Not in the way he meant. I didn't go back to where I was. I didn't rebuild the same thing. I became something else entirely. Stronger, yes, but also harder in places. Wiser, certainly, but with the kind of wisdom earned in the most painful way. Sometimes, late at night, when the city lights are quiet and the work is done, I think about that moment on the stage, his face frozen in disbelief. I don't feel the raw anger anymore, just a quiet understanding of how the forces you unleash can come back to claim you. He tried to bury me, but he only planted seeds. And they grew into something he never could have imagined. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.